Hello and welcome to Primetime. Is the Catholic Church in Ireland in crisis? What's indisputable is that in the past decade its authority has suffered a severe battering and the extraordinary power and influence it once had in Irish society has significantly weakened. But what's also unquestionably true is that the Catholic Church remains of immense importance in the daily lives of very many people living in this country today. In tonight's programme we'll be debating the current situation facing the Church and looking towards the future. First, though, a brief report on some of what's been happening in the Church of late.
The 30 Irish bishops had little in the way of encouraging news to tell the Pope and his Curia when they travelled to Rome last June. Vocations were negligible, mass attendance had dropped by almost a third since John Paul II visited Ireland exactly 20 years before, and the urban young had almost disappeared from the churches. It was a marked contrast to 1979 and the scenes that greeted the Pope in Galway and elsewhere. As he surveyed the throngs of young people from his Pope-mobile, he could have had no idea that the bishop on his left was the father of a 5-year-old boy. The revelations in 1992 by Bishop Eamonn Casey's lover, Annie Murphy, was the single most damaging blow to the authority and influence of the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. The decline in the Church's influence has continued with the mounting number of clerics charged with child sexual abuse and revelations of systematic abuse at institutions run by religious orders. And all over the country, vocation statistics are in crisis. The Dublin mission house, known as Kimmage Manor, was once home to hundreds of young seminarians bound for the missions. It's now partly a building site and partly a retirement home for its ageing Holy Ghost fathers. A recent survey of 30 religious orders revealed an average age of 66.6 years. The age profile of secular or diocesan clergy is rising too. In Cork and Ross, the average priest's age will be 65 in 10 years' time. If the Church is ageing, so are its followers. As they march to Croke Park, the 35,000 or so pioneers made up with enthusiasm what they lacked in youth.
Have you been a member for long? 50 years.
The pioneers pledged to stay away from alcohol for life, and in Ireland the movement is particularly associated with the fight against drugs. The pioneers acknowledge that self-denial is swimming against the tide in late 20th century Ireland and that they may be regarded as old-fashioned, but that doesn't seem to bother them.
I know people say that if you're a journalist you get invited to all the functions and there's a lot of free drink going around. Maybe so, but it's also, I think, a benefit insofar as we're the guys who remember whether the party was a good party or not.
The rally may not have been anything like some of the great religious spectacles of the 20th century, but the pioneers and their ageing priests proved that the Catholic Church can still bring out the crowds. The most visible evidence of the decline of the religious orders are their properties, usually sold to support retired community members. Some property has been made over to welfare organisations. Some orders have contributed their sale proceeds to a loan fund for the use of voluntary groups engaged in social work. The disadvantaged communities of Dublin are among the lowest in mass attendance. Even though their vocation intake has collapsed, the members of religious orders are finding new mission fields in places like Oliver Bond Flats. Here, Sister Bridget Phelan, formerly of the Philippines, now ministers to the families of the inner city.
The first time I met you, Francis, you were coming down at the back of the church, coming down from John's Lane.
The irony is that the inner city residents will have less of Sister Bridget's time. She's been asked to attend to the ageing members of her own community in Clonmel at least one day a week. Not far away in the Franciscan Friary of Merchants Quay, the jobs formerly done by the friars are being done by lay people. Some 70 lay people and only 12 friars now run their tea room and advice centre for the homeless, as well as their services for active and recovering drug addicts and their national school. But lay people can't say Mass, and people are beginning to ask who will bring in the sacrament if there's no priest. There's been no move to permit priests to marry, and the notion of ordaining women is so repugnant to the present pontiff that it can't even be discussed. So what will be the state of the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland in another 20 years, when these children are grown up and have families of their own? Will married priests be the norm? Will there be women priests? Will Roman Catholics be a minority interest group? Or will the bishops discover what it is that is causing people to drift away and succeed in stemming the tide?
Bishop Eamonn Walsh, Auxiliary Bishop of Dublin, do you think the Catholic Church in Ireland is in crisis?
I think it's in transition. I think it's a time of change. I think it's a time when we're shedding an old shell and we're finding a new shape. We're in a transition from a clerically dominated, some people would say, church to a lay church. And the challenge is for us to say, look at what are the gifts of each individual who has faith, and can we harvest those gifts in a way that we can spread the gospel. I would say that the biggest challenge facing the church is addressing, there is in here in everybody, there's a spiritual appetite for God, and it's like our hearts are hungering for God, and how can we feed that? And maybe we have to find totally new ways of doing that. We may have to work through cinema to find what are people's spiritual needs, or maybe we listen to Christy Moore and we just see, has he a spiritual social message? But deep down in here, if we don't fill it with God and the peace that Christ offers, then we're going to fill it with drugs, or we're going to try and find happiness in designer shoes, or we're going to try and find it in alcohol, or whatever it's going to be. But deep down, there is that hunger, and that's the challenge, how to feed it.
Sister Elizabeth Maxwell, do you believe, we listen there to obviously the bishop, he accepts that there is, major problems within the church, but do you believe it can ever get back to the way it was? How do you get young people to go to church?
I don't know that it's even desirable that it should ever get back to the way it was. In relation to the vocation drain or the lack of vocations, I find it sometimes irritating that the present situation is being compared and contrasted with the situation that we experienced in the 50s and 60s, when there was a phenomenal intake, both in religious orders and in seminaries. Now, I have never yet seen an adequate sociological explanation as to why that should have been. But there's one thing sure, it was unusual. And I find it irritating in today's world that we're constantly being compared with that massive number that we had then, and people are saying, how come things are not as good as they were then? I think the people who are coming into religious life and into seminaries today, they're certainly fewer in number.
How many, for instance, do you have in the presentation order did you have last year?
We had one finally professed last year, and we had two a year before that. Very small numbers as compared with times when we had maybe 5 and 6 and maybe 10 and 20, depending on whether you were looking worldwide or whether you were looking at the Irish situation. But what I would say is that the quality of the people, in terms of their maturity, who are committing themselves to this way of life today, is far, far more impressive perhaps than they were in my time. And it wasn't bad. But at 18, I hadn't the maturity that young women of 28 and 32 have today. And so they are very valuable members of our congregations.
Michael D. Higgins, you were brought up a Catholic, but you're disillusioned now, aren't you?
I wouldn't describe my position as disillusioned, as being extremely concerned, much more concerned, I have to say, at the collapse of the public space and the public world than I am, for example, about the Catholic Church as an organisation. I think there's a very different set of issues to be dealt with, and listening to the previous speakers, I can see what they're saying, that we are obviously in conditions of change, but I'm far more concerned about, let us say, the retraction back into selfishness and individualism. That's what I mean by the loss of the public world. And I'm interested, I suppose, as my background in sociology, which was looking at the way that change works itself through the institutions, I think that the bond that people have with each other as citizens and respecting the transcendental aims that they have, there is a moment, let us say, in a person's life when they think beyond themselves, where they need another person, when there are feelings of wanting to be integrated and being in a community that has a cohesive quality to it. I think that was always there as a challenge, and I think that the church lost when it sought to cross the line into the realm of the state, when it sought to contract the civil society back and to say that out of its particular concern, which I respect, it could deliver an absolute into the public realm, which would answer questions which of course it couldn't answer, and which are now really provoking challenges and questions in a way they didn't before.
Ivana Bacik, you're a law lecturer in Trinity. You were also brought up as a Catholic, but you are more harsh in the church, aren't you? You're kind of angry with it.
Yes, I mean, in the sense that certainly I would not describe myself as a Catholic now. I'm an atheist now, despite having been brought up Catholic.
Why?
Because I think at a certain age, when I began to think for myself, I began to see that a lot of what I'd been taught as the absolute rules that Michael D has just described, the sort of absolutes, that these really weren't absolutes. And I think once I started questioning this, as a lot of people I know, and a lot of people I think of my generation and younger would say, that once you start to question these rules and so on, you start to question the entire structure of the church. And yes, it does make me angry the way in which the church has exerted such authority and power within Irish society in particular, throughout my childhood, before and well before that. And I would say that there's a great deal of healthiness in our present society in the way in which we are now beginning to challenge and to question received wisdoms and previous ideas and dogmas. The Pope's visit in '79, I remember I was 11, certainly then people weren't as questioning. I think it's healthier now, that we have less mindless respect for authority in general. I think people are now beginning to see past shells, and real stories are coming out, and I'm talking in particular obviously about sexual abuse of children, about general abuses of children. I think.
But in other words, the church had lost you before any of the scandals.
Yeah, but I think it's the same. It's the same impetus. It's a sort of questioning impetus that causes people individually perhaps to lose their own faith in the church, and also that causes the church as an institution to lose collective respect.
Do you not think there's an absence in your life? I often think that, like, in one thing, if you're brought up as a Catholic, you're taught prayers, and I often say, like, if you're on a plane and it's really turbulent, at the end of the day you say the Memorare because there's nothing else you can do. What do you do?
Well, I'm a humanist. I believe I'm terribly positive about people and about human endeavour and the human spirit. But I certainly don't have a belief in an organised religion. And I'm all for people having their own individual faith, but I would like to see more faith as personal choice.
Robert?
Yes, I would agree with Ivana. I think as an educator, it's extremely important that we encourage people to think. We're not into the process of indoctrination. And certainly religious education, I think, certainly in the last 20 years, has tried to be more open and has tried to encourage people to think. There's a huge desire and a need for spirituality among young people. And certainly most young people, I think, have a problem with church. And that problem stems from the fact that they don't feel they belong. Whereas they have a huge need to experience God. And I think you could ask any religion teacher in any sector within the country, and they will tell you that actually the one area in religious education that is actually quite easy to teach is meditation, contemplation, reflection on scripture. They actually ask for that type of class, that type of prayer.
I don't mean to be, why aren't they going to church then? I mean, I know you teach religion in a girls' convent in South County Dublin, 12 to 18-year-olds, but the statistics even within the own church are showing they don't go to Mass when they come to 17 and 18.
I think part of the problem is actually this whole sense of belonging. I think David Quinn raised it in the earlier primetime films on church. Young people do not feel that they can't identify with parish. School is their parish. School is their Christian community. We will pack a hall for a Mass in their own time at lunchtime on the 2nd of November for All Souls' Day. There's something within them that will come to that. You ask them why, and they'll say, you know, we're all there together. It's a community approach. We're praying for people in need. Evidently, you know, we're directing something at a felt need. Now, in parish, they don't find that. They actually don't find those needs met or addressed. And that's the challenge to us, I think, in church. And perhaps one other observation that I've made, any student who is involved in parish is involved because they're active in liturgy or in youth clubs or have some personal connection with a priest or a sister or somebody involved in parish ministry.
Alice Lawless, you're also a teacher, but you're in a multi-denominational school.
I am, yes, and I'm not particularly interested in the internal debate, you know, within the church, but I do think it's in the interests of everybody in society, non-Catholics as well as Catholics, that the church's role in society be redefined, and that out of this crisis in the church that maybe a new society will evolve. I don't think the problem is Catholicism. I have no problem whatsoever with Catholicism. I think it's the way it evolved historically in Ireland. You know, we got an extremely authoritarian structure, obsessed with Rome, obsessed with sexual morality as against any other form of morality, and its influence stretched into every facet of Irish social life. I don't think that was a healthy position for the church to be in. I think, you know, Irish culture is rooted in Catholicism, and I think it would be a tragedy if people said it wasn't important. I think, as against all the authoritarian negative things about the church, there were so many positive aspects of it. Like, for instance, I mean, Irish people are recognised very much for their spiritual values. I think that is the legacy of the church. We are a compassionate people. We have a sense of community. All those things are important, and I think that, you know, I think that the church needs a thorough, soul-searching look at itself and a redefining in Irish society, and particularly I'm interested in its relationship with the state and in the area of education.
Father Brian, do you feel sometimes that people feel the church has let them down? I often think, you know, older people who were utterly devoted to the church, you know, and for all of their lives, and maybe they just feel so disappointed and let down at this stage.
Strangely enough, I wouldn't say that is the feeling that I would get, Miriam. I would feel it's more a younger generation has felt lost or taken in or confused or sold a pup, as it were. I wouldn't say the older people. I think the older people hold on to a lot of their own faith. They came through a difficult time. They never had anything. Their faith is prayed into them, as it were. And whereas they'd be upset by a lot of things, they understand that they have a personal relationship with God which goes beyond all of this.
Would you
and
feel
I think that's a very good thing.
I know you're a publicly known priest, but do you feel even as a priest that because of all the child sexual abuse scandals that people look at you differently?
Absolutely, there's no question about that, and rightly so. I mean, they should look at us differently. But I look at myself a lot differently to it. I mean, you see, you asked an initial question, you know, is the Catholic Church in crisis? And there's a slight thing in people's minds that the thing that has the Catholic Church in crisis is either because of scandals or because of a fall off of vocations. That's usually what you hear. That is not a crisis. If there's no male celibates wanting to answer 2 calls in one, that's not a crisis. There's no vocations crisis. There are plenty of people who want to use their gifts, as Bishop Eamonn said, in the church in a perfect way. It's just that we're not affirming them enough, ministering to them enough, or we have this closed idea of a single image of church that it must be a clerical church.
I don't understand that. What you're saying is, but there is a problem with vocations.
There is a problem with vocations to male celibacy.
Yeah.
That's what there's a problem with vocations.
Do you think there's a problem with male celibacy? Would you like to be able to get married?
Yeah, but that's not the issue, Miriam. Well, I'll talk about it, and but in this issue, that is not the issue. I have no problem answering that question to you, but the issue is, in this case, where are the people's gifts? What is church? That's really what the issue is.
The laity bringing in ordinary people.
And exact vocations. I mean, the discussion around this table tonight proves there's a huge, beautiful, healthy interest.
But there's 5 people
everything.
here, women, who the Pope wouldn't even consider that we could dream of being a priest. I mean, it's not a fair church.
Good question, but that means, the other question, the answer to that is, I agree with what you've said, that should, and I would argue along with you on that one. But that still isn't the issue. I think the issue is that if you look on the church as a clerical-dominated church, whether it be married men, celibate men, or married or women, it's still a clerical church. I think what we should be looking for is a broad-based church where people accept their communal